Now then, I've made a series of videos where I showed you all of the drawings I did back in 2013 to 2017 on a program called Serif Draw Plus X5. Only I was using text to tell you what's going on, as I didn't have a microphone back then. After that, I made another series where I showed you most of the sketches I did when I was a kid, such as things like Sonic, the Mr. Men, Club Penguin and other things. And soon after, I made yet another series where I talk about some of the shows in Welsh that I grew up watching, with only 4 of them that I reviewed, whilst one was just me explaining that one show where the first episode and a few others couldn't be found online. Except I did have a chance to see it again for decades, that is, while the last one was just me explaining the history of Welsh dubs in general. So, what's gonna be the new series of videos this time? Now, if you're new or known my channel for so long, you know that at the same time while I was making my old Serif drawings, there was another series of videos I made where I showed you all of the VHS tapes and DVDs I watched and owned as a kid, with episodes and footage showing the episodes that are inside of them. I first did it back in November of 2019 with Tomos, then Pingu the following month, then Fireman Sam, then Bob the Builder, and so on and so forth, up until I did it of last year where I showed you all of the other VHSs and DVDs I owned. So, this time around, instead of showing you them, how about I go in depth with them and see how they still hold up? Let's start off with this, shall we? If you're well aware of my content for the past few years, you know I'm a massive fan of this fellow. My long-time experience with Tomos the Tanc engine knows no bounds. I've absolutely adored the series for as long as I've cared. Whether I'd collect and play with some of the toy trains from brands like Wooden Railway, Ertl or Take Along, read some of the various books and magazines, and in the best case of all, watch the stories on television by either on tape or DVD, or when the show would play on Planet Plantbach on S4C. And it's unlike those other things like Pingu, Sam Tan, the Welsh version of Fireman Sam, Sally Mally, Thunderbirds, Les Troops, the French version of the Smurfs, or even Spots the Dog, where I'm considered to be a fan of them. Tomos is what holds my heart the most, in terms of my childhood. And if you don't know already, I grew up with a Welsh dub, as it was the primary language I first spoke back then, if you haven't guessed. As the years go by though, as new content for the franchise showed up, I was always there no matter what, as I was still pretty much a fan. Even though my parents said I was too old to be into Tomos, I would always see what new things that the franchise had been dropping. I was there when the show started using CGI elements for its 12th season in 2008, as well as The Great Discovery. I was there when Hero of the Rails came out and pretty much hyping for it before its release, and also the full CGI series starting with the 13th season. I was there for Misty Island Rescue, Butch's first speaking appearance in the series' 15 episode Stuck on You, Day of the Diesels, which had Diesel 10 as the main villain, both the 16th season and Blue Mountain Mystery, which saw the return of the narrow gauge engines, except for Duncan 2 years later in Series 18, the improved Brenner era, which saw many returns of a few faces, the 70th anniversary, which included 2 feature-length specials, and let's not forget... Oh, yep, I pretty much had a long history with Tomos every time something new arrived, and this is where I began discovering the franchise's pros and its cons, from great episodes, movies and characters, to other things that range from average to an absolute duty. All of this was because I had grown up with the things Wales had translated certain media for me to enjoy from the television series and the books. And this is where I'm going to be talking about this tape, which has an ambiguous title as the cover says, as in Welsh, Dyma ail video mawr Tomos y Tanc Gyfeillion, while the Tomos wiki just simply calls it Tomos the Tank Engine, Bumper Special 1, which is more fitting. Not to mention, the name of the video translates to "Here is the second big Tomos the Tank Engine video," which could mean that it's a follow-up to a tape that came before it. As it turns out, it was a successor to the previous tape, Video Mawr Tomos y Tanc Gyfeillion, which, like the tape I'm going to review, has 18 episodes and is the Welsh version of a tape that has episodes from Series 2. Although the minor difference is that the episode Percy Takes the Plunge has been replaced by Daisy. We'll get back to that tape later on in the video, so without further ado, let's talk about this tape in general. The first thing that appears in the tape is an ident from Video Sign, the company who is responsible for distributing the several VHS tapes and DVDs, and its main company, Sign Records, was behind the dubbing for the 3rd season, up until the 14th season, during the switch to CGI. There's nothing special about this ident, it's just a warning to whoever is watching these tapes with those idents is not to copy or record anything that is in these, as it is a crime to do, as other companies have done it so. After that, we cut to what may be the most familiar sound to you all. Yep, God bless you to us all, Mrs. Allcroft. You brought that little tank engine to television just to be in our childhood memories. Then, of course, who wouldn't forget about that theme song that's so iconic for decades that it would never be forgotten after 2003. So far, the intro looks nice, with the font being changed drastically, as the original had Rockwell fonts used for its titles. Anyway, the episodes on this tape are from Series 3, which, as seen at the back of the tape, didn't come airing around S4C until 1996, 4 years before I was even born. The person who provided narration for this dub is John Ogwen, who you may or may not know him in some things. He was in Hawkmoor, a 5-part series on the BBC back in 1978, played the role of a character named Bostock in the Doctor Who serial Revelation of the Daleks during the Colin Baker years, and was even in Gyfeillion Wen, a Welsh movie in 1997 that was based on the novel by Angharad Jones. He is still pretty much active, as he played the role of Josh Smith from Pobol y Cwm from 2017 to 2019, and as of now, we don't know what he's up to. The first episode to be on this tape is Scarfi Percy, which is the Welsh version of A Scarf for Percy. The episode is pretty decent overall, as it shows Percy being so impatient about wanting a scarf due to the cold weather making him and Thomas hard to cope. He then gets into trouble when the Fat Controller, who's about to take some visitors a tour around the island of Sodor and must be taking photographs of himself, has his trousers in a trunk on a baggage trolley pulled by the porters, and Percy, who was just about to play a trick on the coaches as quiet as possible, doesn't look where he is going and crashes into the trolley, sending the luggage into the air with a crate of jam, dropping onto the little green engine, the Fat Controller, and the passengers. Not only was Percy covered in jam, but the Fat Controller's hat had landed onto his lamp iron, and funnily enough, Sir Topham Hatt's best trousers, making him look like he was literally wearing a scarf, as he wished for earlier. Oh, but there's something that I didn't tell you about this for a long time. When I first saw this scene for the first 3 times or so, when I was very little, I was sort of scared of it. Why? Maybe it's the accident, maybe it's the face Percy makes when he gets covered in jam, I don't know. And whenever the episode plays, I would just run out of the living room and wait until the episode ends, or that I would see the end of the episode until the next one. This also applies to other episodes on other tapes I've watched whenever something so violent, frightening or unsettling happens, like James getting his nose stung by a bee Bee and Buzz Buzz, which I'll get to later on, for Heavy Rain washing away a bridge and Rusty and his crew fixing it in Special Funnel, Scruffy and the Truck singing Pop Goes Old Ollie in Toad Stands By, a tramp steamer running aground, destroying a shed and knocking Paul Cranky over in Cranky Bugs, Henry falling into the sea in Something in the Air, Stepney being held hostage by Ari and Bert in Stepney Gets Lost, and the rest of Down the Mine, which I didn't watch because I knew what was going to happen, as this book showed me what happened. Back to the episode. Percy becomes very foolish of himself and learns his lesson about engines not wearing scarves. The next episode on this tape is Averwyd Percy, Percy's Promise in Welsh. This is the episode I fondly remember the most, as it's got everything in place, like the sets, the music, the characters and whatnot. And funny how the previous episode was about Percy, here he is again at his best in the series. He was given the task of taking the children from the Sunday school home with Annie and Clarabelle as Thomas offered him to help. This setup is kind of unique to see, as it's kind of weird seeing an engine other than Thomas pull Annie and Clarabelle, as those are his main coaches that he pulls, even if he's ill or when some engine borrows them without permission. As Percy is making his begin journey for the children, the weather becomes dreary and rain pours down on the island. The rain then becomes an obstacle for the green caterpillar with red stripes, as the tracks have become flooded and his fire had been put out from the water. Percy's crew then had to find some firewood from a brake van, which the narrator didn't bother to say that Percy's train had it. And here's something that I didn't notice until now when I rewatched the episode. In the original story of the same name the episode is based on from the Railway series book Percy the Small Engine, to make Percy's firebox fizzling again, his crew cut up some of Clarabelle's floorboards to make the green engine running again. Which, if you all know, is her insides! A sentient carriage having her floorboards taken off, which is like a human being getting their organs taken from them. Don't believe me? Listen to this narration from Johnny Morris from the original story and tell me this doesn't sound disturbing as it is.
The fireman went to the guard's van carrying a hatchet. They broke up some boxes, but that didn't satisfy the fireman. "I'll have some of your floorboards, please." But the guard found a hatchet and helped. Soon they had plenty of wood stored in Percy's bunker.
See? Unsettling for a kid's story, isn't it? And I can see why they added a brake van in the television adaptation. To avoid implication of a coach with a face having her insides be ripped up and taken. But overall, it's a good story with Percy braving through the storm, having some help from Harold, and that he kept his promise to Thomas despite everything. After that is Helynt a Hanner, the Welsh version of Time for Trouble that translates to Trouble and a Half. Here we have an episode focusing on James, where the former pulling the express while Gordon is having a rest, which makes him very important and show off to the other engines, making James look like a bit of a narcissist, and the latter, Toby, going to the works to have his parts mended. But as he stops at a junction to take on water, a new signalman has never met Toby before and orders him to continue on to make way for James and the express. And as soon as the tram engine carried on, he ran out of water and is stuck on the line, the same line James is pulling the express. When the red engine heard about this, he was most upset about this and was forced to push Toby while pulling the express. As they reach Knapford Station, a pair of children laugh at James and poke fun at him for being late, with Toby, being the wise old owl he is, tells him to ignore them while James simply scoffs. And the gripe I have with Ogwen's narration is that he barely puts emotion while narrating the stories. Well, okay, not all of the time. Here we have the original English version with Michael Angelis doing James's iconic sarcastic laugh in the episode.
"Ha ha!" said James.
You can tell that he's giving a really good performance, acting like it's night and day when doing the voices for the characters. John Ogwen, on the other hand,
meddai James.
sounds rather dull and has barely put any effort into it. I'm not saying that he's a bad narrator, it's just that he needs to have a bit more flair when voicing the characters. The other gripe I have with Ogwen's narration is when at oftentimes he narrates just when the episode ends as the shots freeze and the music stops altogether, but John just added some narration seconds before they fade to black.
Oh, sir, si brydodd byrsy'n fodlon. Sgyn i fawr i'w ddeud wrth injan heb gap crwn, meddai llais ar ôl at y cefn iddo. Dydyn nhw ddim yn rhyw barchus iawn. Dydw i'n hitio fawr am i olwg o. Mlaen e'n fudur waith pryn. Dwi'n injan enwog iawn beth bynnag meddai Gordon dan i wynt, yn chlywod neb be ddudodd o.
No offense to the man, but I'm pretty sure the editors might have not much space with his narration, so they just leave them out as they are. Back to the tape. The next one is Gordon ar ymwelydd enwog, the Welsh version of Gordon and the Famous Visitor. In this episode, we see that a famous engine has arrived on the island of Sodor and is the centre of attention to everyone, including Diesel for some reason. As a kid, the episode never explicitly told me the name of the engine, as I thought it was just some character who's just a one-off appearing in only one episode, and that I never got to know the name of the engine. That is until years later when I discovered the Tomos community on YouTube and the wiki, and found the name of the engine was City of Truro, which, believe it or not, wasn't a character, but a real-life engine appearing on the show. It turns out that engine wasn't the only one, as other real-life engines had been appearing on the show, whether they have the same name as their counterparts or have the same numbers as them. And as we all know, Gordon is very jealous, thinking that's fuss about nothing. The next day after that, as City of Truro left, Gordon is told by Tomos that the reason the engine is so famous is because he was the first engine to go over 100 miles per hour, and that fact made Gordon even more jealous, mostly because that engine had no dome, as he thinks engines with no domes aren't trustworthy. Later, when Duck told Edward the story, the Blue Engine states that he's obviously jealous, and at that moment, Gordon passes the two engines trying to beat the record City of Truro made. But as he does so, by the time he arrived at the viaduct, a gust of wind blew away his loose dome and flew away into the river underneath the viaduct. This made Gordon feel really silly, as he's the one without a dome now. He gets laughed off by the troublesome trucks and gets mocked by one of the engines at Tidmouth Sheds. This episode just shows how pompous Gordon is, as this is his personality throughout the franchise. We head to Donald's Duck, which is just called... Anyway, an episode focusing on Duck. He's Great Western, can pull any kind of rolling stock, and always works without making a fuss. It was also this episode to first establish Duck having his own branch line, which I didn't notice when I watched this episode as a kid. As Duck is telling his friend Donald about how his branch line is important to him, Donald begins mocking him by making quacking noises, all because of his name, much to Duck's annoyance. So the next day, his crew proposes a plan to pay Donald back for his teasing, and soon that night, they drop something in one of the Scottish twins' water tank, which turned out to be a white duckling. Instead of being cross, Donald found it rather funny, and that the duckling is very friendly towards the engine. Donald soon took the baby duck for a ride, and whenever the other engines see him, they tease him, making the Scottish engine embarrassed. Soon, it was Donald's turn to play a trick on Duck, as he tricked him first. The next morning, Duck's crew found out that there was an egg in a nest box under his bunker, with Donald teasing that he must have laid it during the night, which was what the joke he brought up earlier. In the end, both Duck and Donald settle their differences, and the duckling now resides at a pond near the station, where the station master called her Dilly, but to everyone else, she is Donald's duck. Overall, a pretty nice episode with a wholesome plot. It's interesting to see what Duck does on his branch line, and that I found out the English title for the episode was named after a certain cartoon character made by a huge company.